I was born in Casper, Wyoming, and raised there all my life. I grew up in a place called Dempsey Acres. It was a little bit on the poorer side of town for sure. For the most part, we never ever knew we were poor until later on in life people started explaining to me we were poor. But when I was a young man, my older brother was killed in a motorcycle accident. And I loved my brother very, very much. And I remember the night that he got killed, that I remember being a very confused child and seeing my father crying in the front yard and shaking his fist at heaven and saying, "Why have you taken my boy?" And at 8 years old, that settled kind of heavy in my heart. And I knew that God existed. I always knew God existed. But at that moment, I couldn't figure out why he would do something so evil as to take my brother. So I started building a hatred in my heart for him right there. I would pray to him, but then I just wouldn't believe that he would do anything for me. And I grew up with a misunderstanding that God takes things from us. Now realizing that what he really takes away from us all the time is our sin. But at that time, all I could think is that he takes lives from us and that he takes things that are good and just leaves us live in a world that's filled with junk cars and bad people and abusive parents. My parents were never abusive, but all my neighbors and all my friends, their families were always abusive. They would come to my house because my father would protect them. Later on in time, I was in Albuquerque and I started getting kind of tied up with a little bit of gang life down there, staying with one of my aunts. And I started staying in contact with a kid down there. And next thing you knew, I was running with a little clique up in Casper and starting to develop things. And I always ran with some type of clique, running drugs or alcohol for kids, sold guns. I did a lot of things that 14, 15-year-olds should not do. A buddy of mine, Lance, and I, we built a Sportster when we were kids. I'd promised my dad after my brother died that I wouldn't own a bike until I was 18. But by the time I was 14, I was helping pour change into building a old raggedy 1969 XLCH. And we got that bike running, and, eventually I got caught riding it by the police. And it was my first run-in with the law, really. My dad, I remember how disappointed he was. But, what eventually happened is, being the kind of person that I naturally am, is being a leader, I started joining motorcycle clubs. And I would float right to the top immediately. I was 19 and 20 years old, leading guys that were 30 and 40 years old. They were answering to my beck and call. But none of those clubs were ever hard enough. And eventually I ended up starting a club with a few other guys called the Outdwellers MC. And we never were associated with anybody. What we did is fight very hard to be independent and free, because I believed in that freedom. We lived by a code, and that code was, in serving each other, we become free. I am my brother's keeper, and my honor is loyalty. And we would recite those things all the time. But in all reality, we weren't living up to what we should be living up to. We always thought we were helping society, but, for the most part, we weren't. What we were doing is helping ourselves. I had ceased believing in God altogether, other than the gods that I knew would be rebellion against him. I was an Odinist. I stepped out in a Satru, very much so. And those of you that know what a Satru is, you realize that it is a very heavy religion that is anti-Christian. And what transpired in my life is, you can't run around with a motorcycle club or a motorcycle gang, as what the FBI calls it, before eventually you end up in jail. And I ended up in jail for a double assault and battery. There was a beating of a kid, and they said that I had ordered it done. And the truth of the matter is, I didn't order it done, but I sure didn't discourage it any. But during the course of the fight, I had pointed a finger and I had made a comment, and that was enough to get me convicted of orchestrating it. I was given 180 days in the county jail. While I was in the county jail, several things transpired. The day that I got convicted, I was in a van with a guy named Dale Hunt, and we were headed to the jail. And I remember looking out and seeing my family, all of my club brothers. My wife was sobbing. My father was out there. My mother was out there. My sister, brother. Everybody was on the steps. There was better than 100 people standing out there. And Dale looked over me and said, "Are those your people?" I said, "Yeah, those are my people." He said, "It's good to have people." And as we started heading up to jail, I didn't talk to him much anymore. He was a smaller guy. I could see some Aryan brother tattoos on him. And I ended up in a cell, F13. It was Pod F, cell 13. And when I got in there, I was seriously reevaluating my life. And I believed in my loyalty to brothers. I believed in my loyalty to everything. I had fought and struggled for everything I'd ever got in life. I was such a bitter person. I truly, honestly believe that nobody ever gave me anything. I took everything that I wanted. I'd reach out. If you had something I needed, I took it from you. And you were never big enough or strong enough to keep it from me. I had God so many times try to reach out to me, even when I was a kid. I found a letter years later that a girl had wrote me her whole testimony and invited me to come to Christ. And I remember reading that and making the decision not to do that. I remember a man standing there offering me a Bible and me taking a draw off a joint and blowing the smoke in his face, telling him, "I don't need your Jesus." But here I was in a jail cell, me and my thoughts. You know, when I first got in there, they said for me to pick a book from the library because I was going to the hole for 3 days. And I didn't pick a book. But after I'd been in there about 24 hours, your mind is racing. And I seen a guy walking outside and asked him, "Hey, man, you got something to read?" And he kicked a book underneath my door, and it was The Discipleship of Timothy. I had no idea who Timothy was or what the term discipleship meant. But I started reading this book, and it was missing a bunch of pages. So I really didn't understand it. It was about a Bible guy. It was about this guy following this other dude, and they both believed in this guy, Jesus. And I didn't know that name, but only as a cuss word, and only as somebody I hated. So I read that book, and I held on to it for a bit, but I didn't realize I was about to start my own discipleship. That was God reaching out to me once again. So I ended up in a place called E-Pod. Back then they called it Thunderdome. It was a very, very violent place. I fit in very well there. Most everybody in there was either doing big chunks of time. They were either going to a federal prison or they were going to prison for violence. So when you were in there, you fought for whatever. And they put me in cell 1, which was called the Lion's Den because there was no camera on it. So if a fight broke out inside there, the guards couldn't see because the room was hidden by the staircase. And unless people started paying attention, the guards wouldn't come in the room. So we would fight in there. And since it was my house, I would charge people to fight in my house and make them clean up their own blood. That's how everything started out with me. I fell in right away with there was several different gangs. I fell in right away with the Aryans because I understood that life. I didn't have anything against Hispanic people. My mother's Hispanic. But for whatever reason, I didn't feel that connection there. I knew that there was more strength in the white boy end of it, so that's the direction I went. I sat down and ate breakfast with guys that had beat their wives to death with a hammer. And I thought that was normal because she was a snitch, so that was acceptable. You know, my life was not always about violence, but I never ran from violence. In fact, my brothers, we laughed a lot. We had a lot of good times. We spent a lot of time as family. We spent a lot of time celebrating one another, celebrating each other's accomplishments in life. It wasn't all bad, but it wasn't all God. So what ends up happening is one day, a boy named Whitey, imagine that, is running up the stairs to snatch a note out of a door. And what happens is we used to slide notes through the door from one pod to the other. Bang on the door was called a mail call. You'd snatch it. I had club brothers that had all been thrown in jail, so they were in each of the other pods. So we would slide notes back and forth to one another. And if somebody owed you something from one pod and transferred to yours, we'd get a note and go collect from them. So what had happened is Whitey was running up there and he's getting ready to pull the note. And I looked over my shoulder and I could see an officer in the tower watching us. And I told him, don't grab the note. But it was too late. He'd already got a hold of it. And I could see her get on the radio and start calling for other officers to come into the pod. So we started down the top tier and I told Whitey, you better eat that note. So we didn't catch another charge. So he kept going, and I looked off to my right about cell 20, E20. And there was 12, 15 guys sitting in this cell, and I thought, man, it's better to be locked up for a gathering than it is to get a new charge. So I stepped through that door not knowing what was going on. And the guy that I'd met in the bus, Dale Hunt, him and another guy that I later learned was Jeremy Poole, both leaned up off of a bunk because it was obvious they were leading what was going on. And I said, what's going on? They said, we're doing a Bible study. Are you down with the crown? Are you down with Jesus? And I turned to go. And when I did, all of a sudden time came standing still. On my skin, I tell you, this is fact. When I looked out into that pod and I seen all them guys playing their silly little games down there in their orange costumes, I heard a thunderous boom that rocked me so hard inside. It was like I was holding on to the bass at a drop kick Murphy's concert. And it just shook my insides. And I heard a voice say, this is how you're going to spend the rest of your life. And I went, no way, man. I'm way brighter than all these fools. And again, I hear this thunderous boom rock the inside of me. And all of a sudden, I see that I'm not in jail anymore, but I am with my wife and my kid. I'm watching my wife crying, seeing my kid very confused. I started playing back to all the wrong things I did in my family. The wrong messages I sent to my daughter. The wrong messages I sent to my wife. All my stepping out. All my doing things that were a guy that claims to be a family man and to be a solid, good brother. Doing everything that's against that. But I got to see each and every one of those moments. At that point in time, I'd been married 16 years. It was a lot of wrongs. And again, I hear this thunderous boom. And all of a sudden, I seen all my brothers, all those guys that I had picked up that didn't have family, or their families were so screwed up it wasn't even funny. And how they were just a little bit ornery. But I taught them how to be mean. I taught them that we don't have to take crap off nobody, that we don't have to We don't have to stand down for no man. What we do is we rise above because we were better than everybody else. I told them when they put on that patch that the world would come to its knees before us. And as we lived that lifestyle, that happened so many times that large clubs would come and see us. They'd try to snatch them guys up because they were so great. I took men that had a chance of being good men and turned them into mean men. In the vision, God showed me how many divorces I had caused, how many times men had stepped out on their wives with strippers and everything else that was around us all the time. What the true cost to family was because of the lifestyle we were living. It was almost more than I could take. And again, I hear this thunderous boom. And it shook me to my knees. And all of a sudden, I was standing in this room, what I realize now was my stone heart. What I realize now was a tomb I had built for myself. And as I looked around in there, I could see every evil thing I had ever been involved with from the time I was a little boy. And I'm not talking about the ornery things I did. I'm talking about truly go out of my way to cause harm to another human being thing. There was a lot of laughter in my life, but I didn't see that in my heart. I just saw a lot of things that I had done that really, really crushed people's lives. And I felt guilt for the first time ever. You know, I'd spent my whole life telling people, I don't pretend to be anybody else. If you want to pretend to be somebody, you should pretend to be me. But in that single moment, I wanted to be anything but me. And again, this thunderous boom just rocked my world. And as I looked, the walls shook, and I could see a crack in them. And I love how Jesus comes to everybody else because he seems to show up looking like a 70s hippie, wearing a robe and long flowing hair and knocking on your door all night. And Jesus didn't come to me that way. When I looked through that crack of my stone heart, what I saw was a Christ that was wearing a thorn of crowns for every thought that I ever had that was evil. Took a lash across his back for everything I had done wrong. Bleeding profusely from everywhere, stripped in full shame. And the boom that I kept hearing was that cross that he had over his shoulder, and he was beating it against my heart. And he said, if you let me in, I will be your king. If you let me in, I'll be your savior. I remember turning around and looking and thinking, who could ever forgive any of this? This is beyond anything that Christ can do. This is beyond anything that anybody can do. I've got to live with this. Now that I know that it's here, I didn't even know it was here before, but now I know that this exists. There was a scream that used to. There was a scream that used to wake me up almost every night for years and years. And it was my first victim. first victim of my hatred. And I'm putting this here because I don't talk about this one, but I'm making record of this one. When I turned and looked in my heart, thinking, there's no way Christ can forgive this, I finally seen where that scream was coming from. And there was a little boy in the corner, and he had his face covered. And I remember approaching him and going to touch him, and him slapping me away. And I realized that he was just a little 8-year-old kid that I knew really well. Because the very first victim of my anger and my hatred was me. That's where it all started, right there. And I thought, I can't live with this anymore. And I seen a latch and a door that I didn't notice before. And when I opened it up, when Christ burst into my life, all I can describe him to you as is a brilliant light that washed over everything inside of me. He took that cross that he'd been carrying and stabbed it down in the middle of my heart, and everything for me started to change. The story I just told you seemed like it took hours for all of this to unfold. But I know it was no more than just a quick look out into the pot and a quick look back. Because when I look back into them, I said, yeah, I'm down with Jesus. And I sat down on the floor and went through my first Bible study. That night, as I went back to my cell, I got down on my knees and I started praying and I started confessing my sins. Fortunately, I had a cellie named Weasel, who'd done a lot of time. A very, very smart guy for such a bonehead, I guess. He gets up and gets some toilet paper wet and slaps it over the speaker that is in our cell. He says, brother, you may want to be confessing to God, but you sure don't want to be confessing to the cops everything you're telling me today. And I gave everything up to Christ that day. And I know in that moment, my life started to become different. I still had 18 months left to do before I could retire out of the Outdwellers. And I did them. It was another 3 years after I got saved before my wife got saved. And even a couple more years after that before my daughter did. But the whole thing got down to, I wanted Christ once I really realized who he was. He took me and made me into a new person. The guy sitting here telling you this story is not the guy that lived that story, because that guy died that day. Later on, when I was baptized, we put him underwater and he went to a watery grave. I now go into that county jail where I got saved, and I preach in there every Thursday night. I meet with guys one-on-one. I travel down to Torrington Prison twice a month and visit with those guys, trying to teach them that there is a better way. I go into the juvenile detention center here in Casper, and I talk to kids that are at that same age making those same foolish decisions I made, thinking drinking's cool, getting high is cool. There can be difference. You can have hope in your life, but before you can have real success, you have to have the Holy Spirit dwelling inside of you. And the only way to do that is accept Jesus Christ into your life. I bear all my marks. I earned every one of my tattoos. I am unashamed of all of them because I paid the price for them, just like Christ paid with the scars on him. And they remind me daily that he delivered me, and I know he can deliver you.